Ladies and gentlemen, when we study the life of David, we discover that his strength was not first in the palace or on the battlefield, but in the place of prayer at the dawn of every day. David understood that morning shaped destinies, and he refused to step into his assignments without first aligning his spirit with God. He lifted his voice early, acknowledging God as his source, his direction, and his defense. Before men heard him, heaven heard him. Before decisions were made, his heart was calibrated. David prayed with expectation, with reverence, and with surrender, declaring his trust, his dependence, and his hunger for divine guidance as the foundation of every step he would take that day. David understood the power of early morning prayer as alignment with God, and this understanding shaped the rhythm of his life, his leadership, and his spiritual authority. For David, the morning was not merely the beginning of a new day. It was a sacred gateway where his spirit was tuned before his feet moved. He recognized that whatever controls the first moments of your day often influences the outcome of that day. By rising early to pray, David was making a clear statement that God was not an afterthought, not an emergency option, but the first voice he needed to hear. This posture of alignment meant that his emotions, his thoughts, and his intentions were submitted before pressures, people, and problems had the chance to speak. In the stillness of the morning, David brought his heart before God, not pretending strength, but acknowledging dependence, knowing that alignment precedes empowerment. Early morning prayer for David was a place of spiritual ordering. He understood that life is full of competing voices, and if God's voice was not the loudest, confusion would dominate. When he prayed early, he was allowing God to define truth, direction, and perspective before the noise of the day arrived. This was not a ritual driven by fear or obligation, but a deliberate choice to seek clarity. David knew that battles are often won or lost long before swords are drawn. An alignment in prayer positioned him to discern what was of God and what was not. By presenting himself before God at the start of the day, he was saying that divine instruction mattered more than human opinion, and that spiritual sensitivity was more valuable than physical strength. David's early prayer life also reflected his understanding of divine order. He recognized that when God is placed first, everything else finds its rightful position. His prayers were not rushed, conversations squeezed into a busy schedule, but intentional moments of communion. In these moments, David poured out his soul, expressing trust, repentance, gratitude, and expectation. This alignment kept his heart tender, preventing pride from growing in seasons of victory and despair from consuming him in seasons of loss. Morning prayer became a stabilizing force, anchoring his identity in God rather than in circumstances. Because he aligned himself daily, he could face unpredictable events with a settled heart. Alignment in the morning also meant surrendering control. David understood that no matter how skilled or anointed he was, he still needed God's guidance for that specific day. He did not assume that yesterday's grace was sufficient for today's demands. Each morning prayer was an admission that he needed fresh direction, fresh wisdom, and fresh strength. This posture protected him from presumption, teaching him to rely on God continuously rather than occasionally. Through early prayer, David yielded his plans, allowing God to correct, confirm, or redirect them before they became actions. This is why, even in complex situations, David could pause and inquire of the Lord, because alignment had become his lifestyle. There was also a dimension of intimacy in David's morning prayers. These were not cold, distant communications, but heartfelt encounters. David spoke to God as a shepherd speaks to the owner of the flock, knowing that guidance flows from relationship. In the quiet of the morning, his affection for God was renewed and his love was rekindled. This intimacy produced confidence, not arrogance, but assurance that he was known and heard. When a man begins his day knowing he has been with God, fear loses its grip, and courage rises naturally. David's boldness later in the day was a direct product of the alignment he secured in prayer at dawn. Early morning prayer also aligned David's spiritual vision. It helped him see beyond immediate threats to eternal purposes. When enemies surrounded him or responsibilities overwhelmed him, his perspective was already shaped by divine truth. He had already reminded his soul of who God was and what God had promised. This prevented panic and reactionary decisions. Alignment trained him to respond from faith rather than react from emotion. By the time challenges appeared, his inner man had been strengthened, his hope had been restored, and his confidence had been anchored in God's faithfulness. David's example reveals that alignment is not automatic, it is cultivated. Waking up early to pray required discipline, sacrifice, and intentionality. He chose God over comfort, communion over convenience. This choice consistently positioned him to walk in wisdom and favor. Alignment through morning prayer became the foundation upon which his leadership stood. It influenced how he ruled, how he fought, how he repented, and how he worshipped. When alignment is lost, strength becomes dangerous, but when alignment is maintained, even weakness becomes powerful. Through his commitment to early prayer, David teaches that spiritual authority flows from spiritual order. When the heart is aligned, actions follow correctly. When the spirit is aligned, decisions carry clarity. Morning prayer was David's way of ensuring that his inner world was rightly positioned before engaging the outer world. This alignment did not remove challenges, but it prepared him to face them with confidence, humility, and faith. It kept him sensitive to correction and open to instruction. It reminded him daily that success without God is failure, and victory without alignment is temporary. In aligning himself with God at the start of each day, David demonstrated a timeless principle that destiny responds to devotion. The act of seeking God early was not about earning favor, but about positioning for grace. Alignment through prayer ensured that David did not drift spiritually, even when surrounded by power, influence, and responsibility. It kept his heart responsive and his spirit alert. This daily alignment was the unseen foundation behind his public victories, the quiet strength behind his bold declarations, and the secret place that sustained his public life. He acknowledged God as his source before engaging daily responsibilities, and this recognition governed how David lived, thought, and acted each day. David understood that ability without source eventually leads to exhaustion, pride, or confusion. Before he confronted tasks, people, or pressures, he first confronted his own dependence on God. This acknowledgement was not a vague confession, but a deep awareness that life, strength, wisdom, and success flow from God alone. By recognizing God as his source early, David refused to let self-sufficiency take root in his heart. He knew that titles, skills, and past victories could never replace the necessity of divine supply. Every morning became an opportunity to remind his soul that without God, even the strongest man is limited. David's acknowledgement of God as his source shaped his humility. No matter how anointed he was, he did not assume automatic success. He understood that every day carries unique demands, and each demand requires fresh grace. By starting his day with God, he was saying that yesterday's victories could not sustain today's assignments. This posture kept him teachable and sensitive. He did not rush into responsibilities driven by confidence in his own understanding, but he leaned on divine wisdom. A heart that acknowledges God as its source remains open to instruction, correction, and redirection. David's life reveals that humility is not weakness, but wisdom that preserves longevity. Recognizing God as his source also gave David stability. When people praised him, he did not become intoxicated by applause because he knew where his strength came from. When people criticized him, he was not destroyed because his validation was not rooted in human approval. His source was constant, even when circumstances changed. This awareness protected his identity. David did not define himself by what he did, but by who sustained him. Daily acknowledgement of God as his source anchored his emotions and thoughts, enabling him to remain balanced in seasons of honor and in seasons of rejection. Before engaging daily responsibilities, David deliberately placed God above urgency. He understood that urgency without direction leads to wasted effort. Many people are busy but misaligned because they rush into activity without consulting the source of wisdom. David avoided this trap by acknowledging God first. He knew that a few moments of divine instruction could save hours of human struggle. By submitting his day to God, he allowed divine order to shape his schedule, priorities, and responses. This acknowledgement meant that not every opportunity was accepted and not every battle was fought. God, as the source, determined what was necessary and what was distraction. Acknowledging God as his source also influenced David's courage. His boldness was not rooted in physical strength or numbers, but in the assurance that God was backing him. When he faced giants or overwhelming opposition, he did so with confidence because he had already drawn strength from his source. This daily connection meant that courage was renewed before fear could settle. David did not wait for danger to seek God. He sought God before danger appeared. As a result, when challenges arose, his spirit was already fortified. Strength drawn early prevented panic later. This recognition shaped how David handled responsibility. Leadership did not make him independent of God, it made him more dependent. He understood that influence increases accountability. The greater the responsibility, the greater the need for divine guidance. By acknowledging God as his source each morning, David acknowledged that leadership without God becomes dangerous. Decisions affecting many lives required more than human intelligence. This awareness led him to seek God's counsel consistently. It preserved him from reckless choices and impulsive reactions. Responsibility driven by acknowledgement of God as source becomes stewardship rather than control. David's acknowledgement of God as his source also affected his worship. His praise was not transactional. He worshipped because he knew who sustained him. Gratitude flowed naturally from this awareness. Each morning became an act of thanksgiving, recognizing that breath, opportunity, and strength were gifts. This posture of gratitude protected his heart from entitlement. He did not approach life demanding outcomes, but receiving grace. A man who knows his source lives with appreciation rather than complaint. David's Psalms reveal a heart deeply conscious of God's sustaining power, and this consciousness was renewed daily. By acknowledging God as his source, David also guarded himself against burnout. He understood that human energy has limits, but divine supply is endless. Starting his day with God allowed him to draw from a well that never runs dry. This spiritual replenishment enabled him to endure long seasons of pressure without losing joy or focus. He was not driven solely by ambition, but sustained by communion. This distinction is crucial because ambition without divine source consumes, but purpose sustained by God renews. David's consistency was a product of daily dependence. This acknowledgement created alignment between David's inner life and outer actions. His confidence was not noisy but settled. His decisions were not rushed but deliberate. Knowing his source gave him peace. When outcomes were delayed or unclear, he trusted the source rather than forcing results. This trust allowed patience to grow. David could wait because he knew that the same God who supplied strength would also orchestrate timing. Acknowledging God as source trains the heart to rely on divine processes rather than human shortcuts. Before stepping into his daily responsibilities, David positioned God as the origin and sustainer of all he would do. This positioning ensured that his actions flowed from relationship, not pressure. It meant that success was measured by obedience rather than appearance. His life teaches that when God is acknowledged as source, work becomes worship, duty becomes devotion, and challenges become opportunities for divine expression. This daily acknowledgement shaped David's walk, preserved his heart, and empowered his obedience. It established a foundation where confidence did not compete with dependence and strength did not replace surrender. He sought divine guidance before making decisions or taking action, and this habit defined the wisdom that distinguished David's life from many around him. David understood that movement without direction can be more dangerous than waiting, and action without guidance can lead to regret. He refused to trust impulse, emotion, or assumption, knowing that spiritual sensitivity must lead physical steps. Before he moved forward, he inquired of the Lord, acknowledging that God sees what the human eye cannot see. This practice revealed David's respect for divine intelligence above human reasoning. He knew that correct decisions are not always obvious, and discernment is cultivated in the presence of God, not in the pressure of urgency. Seeking divine guidance protected David from reactionary living. He did not allow circumstances to dictate his responses. Whether he was facing threat, opportunity, loss, or advancement, he paused to seek God's counsel. This pause was not weakness, it was strength under control. David understood that the speed of response does not equal accuracy of response. By seeking guidance, he allowed truth to settle his emotions and clarity to override fear. This discipline prevented him from making permanent decisions based on temporary emotions. His life demonstrates that spiritual maturity is revealed in restraint, not haste. David's pursuit of divine guidance shows that he valued obedience more than convenience. Sometimes God's instructions were not the fastest or easiest routes, but David trusted the wisdom of God over personal comfort. He understood that guidance from God carries protection even when it seems demanding. This trust enabled him to follow instructions that contradicted natural logic. He knew that God's direction may not always explain itself, but it always preserves purpose. By choosing guidance over impulse, David safeguarded his destiny from unnecessary detours. Seeking guidance also kept David aware of timing. He recognized that knowing what to do is incomplete without knowing when to do it. Divine guidance revealed not only direction but season. There were moments when David was anointed but instructed to wait, prepared but told to remain hidden. Without guidance, he could have forced himself into positions prematurely. By seeking God before acting, he learned patience and discernment. This waiting refined his character and strengthened his trust. Timing shaped by divine counsel ensured that when David acted, he did so with authority rather than presumption. David's dependence on guidance cultivated spiritual sensitivity. The more he sought God, the more attuned he became to subtle instructions. His spirit learned to recognize divine nudges, warnings, and confirmations. This sensitivity was not accidental. It was the product of consistent communion. By seeking guidance daily, David trained his inner ear to recognize God's voice. This spiritual awareness distinguished him in moments of crisis. When others panicked or guessed, David inquired. When others reacted emotionally, David responded spiritually. This pursuit of guidance also influenced David's leadership. He understood that leading others requires hearing from God on their behalf. Decisions affecting many lives demanded more than personal preference. David knew that leadership without divine counsel leads to oppression, confusion, and misalignment. By seeking God before making decisions, he ensured that his leadership reflected God's heart rather than human ambition. This approach built trust and stability. People followed him not only because of his strength, but because of the wisdom evident in his choices. David's life reveals that divine guidance brings clarity in complexity. Situations were rarely simple, yet guidance simplified direction. When facing multiple options, God's counsel narrowed his focus. This prevented distraction and divided attention. Seeking guidance enabled David to discern priorities. He learned when to fight and when to withdraw, when to speak and when to remain silent. This discernment preserved energy and focus. Guidance does not eliminate challenges, but it eliminates confusion about response. Seeking divine guidance also strengthened David's confidence. Once direction was received, he moved with assurance. Doubt diminished because his confidence was anchored in obedience rather than outcome. He knew that obedience guarantees alignment even when results are delayed. This confidence allowed him to stand firm in opposition. He was not easily swayed by criticism or resistance because his actions were rooted in divine instruction. A man who has heard from God does not need constant affirmation from people. David's consistent inquiry of God also reveals his understanding of limitation. He acknowledged that human understanding is incomplete. This acknowledgement did not weaken him. It refined him. He did not pretend to know everything. By seeking guidance, he honored God's omniscience. This humility preserved him from arrogance. It allowed growth to continue. Guidance became a channel through which wisdom increased. Each inquiry expanded his understanding and deepened his trust. Seeking guidance before action also aligned David's desires with God's will. Prayer transformed his intentions. Sometimes what he wanted initially changed after communion with God. Guidance purified motives. It prevented selfish ambition from directing action. This alignment ensured that his pursuits were not merely successful, but meaningful. Actions driven by guidance carried eternal value. David did not merely accomplish tasks, he fulfilled assignments. This habit of seeking guidance shaped David's peace. Uncertainty did not torment him because he knew where to go for answers. When direction was unclear, he waited without anxiety. His peace was not rooted in control, but in trust. Guidance became his anchor. This trust enabled him to remain calm in uncertainty and hopeful in delay. Seeking God before acting trained his heart to rest even when outcomes were unseen. David's example teaches that divine guidance is not reserved for emergencies, but required for daily living. He did not wait until confusion overwhelmed him before seeking God. He made guidance a lifestyle. This consistency preserved momentum and prevented crisis-driven spirituality. By seeking God before decisions, David stayed ahead of danger rather than reacting to it. His life shows that wisdom is proactive, not reactive. Through his pursuit of divine guidance, David demonstrates that destiny unfolds best when steps are ordered. Action guided by God carries authority. Movement directed by heaven carries impact. Seeking guidance before acting ensured that David's life progressed with purpose rather than accident. His obedience became strategic. His patience became powerful. His decisions reflected alignment rather than assumption. This commitment to guidance sustained him through uncertainty, preserved him through transition, and established a legacy shaped by divine counsel rather than human impulse. His confidence for the day flowed from intimacy with God, not circumstances. And this truth explains the unusual stability that marked David's life. David did not draw his assurance from what he saw around him, but from who he had encountered in the secret place. Before facing people, problems, or pressures, he first encountered God, and that encounter shaped his inner posture. Intimacy gave him a settled heart. When a man has stood before God, external situations lose the power to define his emotions. David's confidence was not loud or arrogant. It was quiet, rooted, and deeply anchored in relationship. This inner assurance was cultivated long before the day's challenges appeared. David understood that intimacy is the birthplace of true confidence. Knowing God personally produced trust, and trust produced boldness. He was not confident because everything was predictable, but because God was faithful. Intimacy reminded him of God's character, not just God's power. He knew God as a shepherd, a defender, a refuge, and a guide. This knowledge was not theoretical, it was experiential. Each morning encounter reinforced his awareness that God was present and involved. When intimacy is strong, fear has no space to dominate. Confidence becomes a natural response to relationship rather than a forced reaction to threat. This intimacy insulated David from emotional instability. Circumstances changed, but his confidence remained consistent. When he was celebrated, he did not lose himself in pride. When he was rejected, he did not collapse in despair. His emotional equilibrium came from communion, not environment. By beginning his day with God, David anchored his identity in divine acceptance. This anchoring prevented him from becoming dependent on human affirmation. A man who knows he is accepted by God does not live desperate for approval. Intimacy establishes identity, and identity sustains confidence. David's confidence flowing from intimacy also meant that he could face uncertainty with peace. Intimacy reassured him that even when outcomes were unclear, God was in control. He did not need to understand everything to trust God. This trust produced calmness. His peace was not circumstantial, it was relational. He knew the one who held his future. Morning intimacy reminded him that God was already present in the day ahead. This awareness removed anxiety about what might happen. Confidence rooted in intimacy rests, even when the path is unfamiliar. Through intimacy, David developed an internal strength that could not be shaken by external opposition. Enemies could threaten, but they could not intimidate his spirit. Challenges could arise, but they could not destabilize his faith. Intimacy produced resilience. It strengthened his inner man. When pressure increased, intimacy sustained him. He did not wait until he was overwhelmed to seek God. He sought God to remain stable. This proactive communion ensured that when difficulties came, his confidence was already established. David's intimacy with God also shaped how he interpreted circumstances. He did not see challenges as proof of abandonment, but as opportunities for God's faithfulness to be revealed. Intimacy changed his perspective. He saw life through the lens of relationship. Because he knew God personally, he trusted God's intentions. This trust prevented suspicion and bitterness. Confidence rooted in intimacy interprets hardship differently. It expects God to work, even in adversity. David's confidence was hopeful, not naive, grounded in knowledge of God's ways. This intimacy also gave David courage to confront fear. Fear thrives where intimacy is absent. By staying close to God, David weakened fear's influence. He did not deny fear's presence, but he refused to let it lead. Intimacy reminded him of God's nearness. When God is near, fear loses authority. David's courage was not the absence of fear, but the dominance of trust. Each encounter with God reinforced this trust, enabling him to face the day with bravery. David's confidence flowing from intimacy also meant that his joy was not easily stolen. Joy rooted in circumstances fluctuates, but joy rooted in relationship remains. Intimacy filled his heart with assurance and hope. Even in difficult seasons, he could worship because his confidence won comfort. Joy became a byproduct of closeness with God. This joy strengthened him. It energized his spirit. A joyful heart approaches the day with expectancy rather than dread. David's mornings with God fueled a joy that carried him through the day. Intimacy also refined David's conscience. Confidence without intimacy can become reckless, but confidence shaped by intimacy remains humble. Being close to God kept David sensitive. He was confident yet teachable, bold yet repentant. Intimacy prevented pride from corrupting confidence. He knew that his strength came from God, not himself. This awareness kept his confidence aligned with dependence. True intimacy produces confidence that bows, not boasts. Through intimacy, David also learned to trust God with outcomes. His confidence was not in guaranteed results, but in God's faithfulness. This trust freed him from anxiety about success or failure. He focused on obedience rather than performance. Intimacy reassured him that God valued his heart above his achievements. This understanding removed pressure. Confidence rooted in intimacy does not strive. It rests in alignment. David's peace came from knowing that God was pleased with his pursuit, not merely his productivity. David's life reveals that intimacy with God is not an emotional experience reserved for special moments, but a daily encounter that shapes perspective, strength, and courage. By beginning his day in God's presence, he secured a confidence that no circumstance could give and no circumstance could take away. This confidence guided his reactions, strengthened his faith, and preserved his heart. Intimacy became the well from which his courage, peace, joy, and assurance continually flowed.